Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Today in your host chair is me, the one and only, Kai McAllister, and today we have a small panel of two, if you will, if you can even call it a panel at that point. And my fellow co-host for today's episode is none other than the illustrious Evan Buck.
Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
Yes, indeed. So today on this two-person panel, we have a topic which is very near and dear to our hearts, and I'm sure that Evan and I will have an opportunity to explain why this particular individual around whom this episode orbits is of significance to Evan and myself. If you're expecting some sort of highly sentimental or ancestral lineage of one of us going back to Millard Fillmore, I can preface this by saying you'll be sorely disappointed. But if you are looking for something that's more lighthearted, silly, and quintessentially A-fit, I think you'll be happy with why Evan and I cherish this president so much. But I'm not going to be the one to introduce this fork. I'm going to toss it over to Evan, whose idea this entire fork was, and he'll tell us who this fork is about. Evan, the floor is yours.
Yes, exactly. Let's get right into it. So today we are going to be talking about, as Kai foreshadowed, a former president of the United States, one of the more obscure presidents back in the 1800s, one of, I would say a series of presidents that not many people are super well aware of, and that is of Millard Fillmore. I mean, Millard Fillmore. Yes, Millard Fillmore actually was the name of a comic strip that I used to read as a kid, but I think a lot of the jokes went over my head because I think they were more political, satirical in nature. But be that as it may, it is not Millard Fillmore, it is Millard Fillmore. And in order to understand a little bit of the fork in time we're going to be covering today, let's back up a little bit to if I remember correctly, it was like one of the second, maybe it was the third major party realignment. I'm not really sure. I kind of lose track of them after the second. But America has had a two-party system for pretty much its entire life, as far as I'm aware, except for maybe some small instances like the era of good feelings, where James Monroe basically just completely obliterated the opposition. We've lived in the reality of a two-party political system. Now, those parties have maybe switched seats over time, but we've lived in a two-party system for most of our nation's existence. And at one point, before the Republican Party existed, there were two main political parties, the Democrats or the Democrat-Republicans, depending on how long you want to believe that party still called itself the Democratic-Republican Party, and the Whig Party. And that is Whig as in W-H-I-G, not as in, well, without the G and all the stuff that fancy European and American people would wear. But no, it is Whig with an H. And the Whig Party came about in, around the 1820s, 1830s timeframe. And they were opposed, of course, to the Democratic Party. And this was the party that Millard Fillmore came from. But he actually did not ascend to the presidency on his own right. He instead was elected as the vice president alongside the Mexican-American war hero Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor ran with Fillmore on a ticket and defeated the Democrats. Zachary Taylor was president for, I think, it was over a year, maybe a little less than 2 years. But be that as it may, Zachary Taylor passed away while he was in office, thanks to a bowl of cherries and milk That's actually true. You can look it up. That is most likely what caused President Taylor's demise. And so Fillmore ascended to the presidency, and he served out the rest of Taylor's term for about 2 years and 8 months or so. Now, what's interesting about Fillmore is that he was the last Whig president, and he was actually the last president up until this point, the modern day, to be neither from the Democratic or Republican parties. The Whig Party was a very interesting political party. It had some notable names in their ranks that you might not have expected, including former President John Quincy Adams, who he was a Federalist, I believe, but he served as a congressman after being president, and he was a member of the Whig Party. Abraham Lincoln also started his career in the Whig Party as a congressman before he joined their upstart Republicans. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were also very notable members of the Whigs. While the party itself was pretty much dead after the 1852 election, a lot of its ideas continued to have pretty profound effects on American politics long thereafter, especially in the new upstart Republican Party. Fillmore's presidency was one of the first that was, again, as I mentioned before, one of those more obscure presidents, a string of obscure presidents in the lead up to the Civil War. And it was marked by a lot of hand-wringing and compromise attempts on the issue of slavery. Now, something that will come up quite a bit during the show, I imagine, is that Fillmore himself was personally against slavery. But he was a rather strict constitutionalist in that he believed the federal government didn't really have the power to actually stop it. And he read the Constitution in a certain way that slavery was permitted. So, and being the compromiser-in-chief that he was fairly instrumental in passing the Compromise of 1850. This was a package of 5 bills that were sent through Congress, which arguably helped delay the start of the Civil War by giving major concessions to both sides. Zachary Taylor himself was opposed to the compromise and actually largely sidelined Fillmore during his presidency. But Taylor's death and Fillmore's ascension to the office cleared the way for the compromises to get done. One of our other favorite people that we like to mention during the podcast is good old Commodore Perry. And Commodore Perry, of course, tried to open up Japan via good old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy. That also took place under Fillmore's presidency. So what went wrong for Mr. Millard Fillmore? Ultimately, he ticked off enough people on both sides, especially with the Fugitive Slave Act portion of the Compromise of 1850, to where he sought but failed to receive his party's nomination in 1852. And for those who aren't aware, the Fugitive Slave Act basically said that any slaves which fled their slave owner in the South and made their way up to the North for freedom could and actually should be forcibly returned back to their owners. The Whig Party in 1852 ended up nominating Winfield Scott, and as Dylan Holzmer would famously say, he was, at this point, wenched onto a horse. He was getting up there. He was pretty old at this point. And they were largely disintegrating as a party. And in 1852, they lost. This was basically the death knell of the party on a national stage. A lot of anti-slavery Whigs ended up bolting to join the upstart Republican Party. So, with this very meandering introduction in mind, this is where we get to our fork in time. The 1856 election had 3 main candidates involved. The Democrats nominated James Buchanan, who I guess at this point we could say is starting to become a friend of the pod. We haven't really ripped on him too much enough to where he gets that status, but I guess we can give him an honorary friend of the pod label. I'm sure we'll find a way to rip on him even more during the course of this show.
I was going to say, I think this will be the episode where we do just that.
Exactly. So the Democrats nominate James Buchanan. The upstart Republican Party nominates John C. Fremont of California exploratory fame. And a third political party known as the Know-Nothings, or formerly referred to as the American Party, but they're commonly referred to as the Know-Nothings because they had some sort of like weird, being sworn to secrecy kind of thing, definitely not part of the mafia or whatever. And so when anybody asked them what their activities were about or what the party was about, they would say, I know nothing. hence why they were called the Know-Nothings. Millard Fillmore was not himself actively seeking their nomination or running for president, but the Know-Nothings cycled through a couple of candidates who didn't really want to run on their ticket. And they're like, you know what? Let's call Fillmore out of retirement. Why not? Why don't we, bring him back on and get him on the saddle and run on our behalf? Fillmore himself wasn't super nativist, and that's what the Know-Nothings are known for. They're a very nativist party. They're very anti-immigration, and they were trying their best to thread the needle when it comes to slavery. They didn't really want to abolish slavery, but they didn't really want to see it expanded either. So Fillmore was like, you know what? Fine. You guys nominated me. I'll run for you guys. Why not? I'll go for it. I'll give it the old college try. In our timeline, the election goes fairly decidedly in Buchanan's favor. Fremont wins the Northeast and a good chunk of the Midwest. Buchanan wins California, Texas, the Deep South, a good chunk of the Midwest as well, his home state of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. Fillmore has one of the best showings of a third-party candidate. I believe, if I remember correctly, he's the last third-party candidate to have won a state of his own right. He won Maryland. I do know that, actually, I think that's incorrect, because I know George Wallace won some Deep South states. I know there was like another states' rights party in the 60s, but I think in terms of his, actively campaigning of his own right, he, I think, has one of the strongest third-party candidacies in American history. He won 21.
I think in terms of percentage of vote, you're just about to say
I was just going to say, in terms of the percentage of the vote, he won 21.5% of the vote, which is quite strong for a third party and for a former president who was kind of on the outs. Like when you're an incumbent president and you don't get renominated by your party, that's kind of bad. That's kind of bad for you. So, be that as it may, Buchanan wins in 1856 in our timeline, and that's what sets up a lot of the events, which ends up leading to the Civil War in 1860. However, the fork in time that we're going to be talking about today is Millard Fillmore making a political comeback. Bill Clinton was known as the comeback kid. Well, Fillmore would actually upstage him by about over a century and a half almost, in becoming the first main American political comeback kid. And the way that we're going to do this is what we always like to do with making a third-party candidate win a presidential election, is to have a contingent election. Now, I would love to delve into the specifics of this, but because I have been soapboxing for quite some time to help set up the fork, I'm going to throw it over to Kai to explain how we're going to make Fillmore not only the 13th president, but the 15th president as well.
Yes. So for those who are not experts on how American electoral politics work, I don't blame you, because it's quite a complicated system. And that's exactly why scenarios such as these, where we have Fillmore winning the presidency despite not winning a majority, nor even a plurality of the states, is possible. And the way that it works is, of course, each state is allocated its electors, and the person who now it would be the person who crosses the 270 threshold wins the presidency. Back then, of course, there were not 270 electors to my knowledge, and so it would have been a different number back then. But essentially, if someone doesn't reach that threshold where they receive 51% of the electors, we get into a position where there's no actual winner. And in that scenario, the election then goes to the House of Representatives to decide. And that's where we have this election going, is we have Fremont winning his collection of states, Buchanan winning his selection of states, and then we have Fillmore coming in with a 4-state tally in his favor. Which 4 states? Well, Evan somewhat foreshadowed them in his analysis. We have him continuing to hold the state which he won in our timeline, Maryland. But in addition, we also have him winning the states of Louisiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And the reason why we choose those states is because in our timeline, in the election, he lost those states by about 3, 4, and 5% respectively, meaning that with some very tenacious campaigning, a good ground game, stuff of that nature, things that are required to win states, he could very conceivably have pulled this off and won these states, especially with a more competent campaign. And so we have him executing that, winning those states. And if we grant him those states, we do not have a single candidate emerging with a plurality of electors. And so then the House of Representatives is going to make the decision. Now, you might ask, okay, in this scenario, Evan did the math on one of the electoral college mapping software mapping sites out there. And if you do the calculation, it comes out to Fremont having a total of 114 electors with all of his states, Buchanan emerging with 144 electors, and then Fillmore emerging with a mere 38 electors. So the question becomes, okay, well, Buchanan still wins because he has the most electors, but that's not how it works. Congress the House of Representatives is not at all required to select the president as being the person who has the most electoral votes. They can choose anyone. And so in this scenario, they're going to end up choosing Fillmore, even though he has a paltry 38 electors, because he can be seen as the compromise candidate. Remember, we have Fremont, John C. Fremont, who is the Republican, and we have James Buchanan, who is the Democrat. The central issue that's going to be separating them is slavery. Buchanan is favored in the South because he is largely pro-slavery, or at least sympathetic to the plight of the slaveholding states. Whereas John C. Fremont is, again, the first Republican candidate, the Republican Party being founded as sort of an anti-slavery abolitionist party. And then you have Fillmore in the middle, who himself is opposed to slavery, but is very much a staunch unionist, meaning he's not amenable to any sort of attempts to aggravate or create further acrimony with the southern states. So he is going to be one to kind of toe the line of not being himself pro-slavery, but also not engaging in, these sort of aggressive overtures with the South. And so
keep in mind
have
that,
House of Representatives.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but to keep in mind, Fillmore saw the abolitionist position and, the Republicans, Fremont, as a bigger threat because he believed that if they got in, that would lead to the South seceding, civil war, the country's going to break apart. So while he's not ideologically Buchananista when it comes to, being sympathetic to the South and, wanting the institution of slavery to continue, he wants the Union to continue. And so he's going to do whatever he can to try and continue to whip up some compromise magic pixie dust to keep the Union together. That's his central goal. He wants to be able to find something to please both sides.
Precisely. And on those grounds, the House of Representatives decides that Millard Fillmore will be the next president. And I would add that one other thing that might be convincing the House of Representatives that this is a good idea is because Millard Fillmore is a prior president. He's a known entity. And if there's one thing that we know about Congress, and I think this spans all of congressional history and indeed beyond congressional history into politics generally, governing bodies tend to favor the status quo. And so Millard Fillmore being a known entity, being a compromise candidate, he has all of the right arrows in his quiver to essentially appeal to the House of Representatives as a good compromise candidate for the presidency. And therefore, we have to now consider what would have happened, what would be different in a second Fillmore term.
Exactly. And before we get into that, there's also one little small fun fact that I want to throw into this as well. We all remember Grover Cleveland as being the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. And of course, now at the time of this recording, the current president, Donald Trump, he has become the second president in history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But Fillmore, in this alternate timeline, would have actually become the first. So that's an interesting little historical nugget of knowledge to take forward as we move along this alternate timeline.
Indeed. Yeah, I know lots of other countries, the idea of non-consecutive terms is so familiar to them. But here in America, it's actually quite a rare phenomenon. It's only been done twice in our nation's history, and this would be a third time, theoretically.
Yes, precisely. So, with all of this being set up the way we had, I think the major elephant in the room, which I think is probably going to dominate a lot of the course of this episode's discussion, is, of course, the main issues of the 1856 election, which are slavery and the possibility of, Southern secessionism. And really, the main question that we're positing for us and for our listeners is, how would things change? Would they change? What if essentially Buchanan was not in office and he basically did literally nothing to stop the Civil War from breaking out? In fact, arguably, he actually was somewhat helping the secessionist cause. We can get into details on that later. But I think with even just the tone and tenor of the lead up to a possible civil war would be a lot different, because you're not going to have a president asleep at the wheel, tacitly supporting Southern secessionism. You're going to have a president who is, from day one, very adamantly opposed to secession, very much wanting the Union to stay together. Whether that's enough to actually keep the country together, we'll see during the course of our discussion. But I think I'll just start kicking the can down the road a little bit, and we can take things from there by my first postulation, which is, I think there is a pretty decent chance that the border states of Kentucky and Tennessee start aligning themselves a little bit more with the Union as opposed to the South as they did in our timeline. And Kentucky stayed Union, Tennessee went for the Confederacy. But I think in this alternate timeline, there's actually a really strong chance, in my view, that both states stick with the Union. And I think the main reason for that is because, in this alternate timeline, they both vote for Fillmore, someone who is a Unionist, someone who doesn't want to see slavery necessarily expand, but he also doesn't want to completely do away with slavery. So I think the impetus for intense secessionism in both states would probably be clamped down quite a bit. What do you think about that assertion?
I think it's plausible. I think the bigger thing here that is going to be making the most impact is not so much the fact that Fillmore is serving a second term. I think the more impactful thing here is that James Buchanan is not serving at all.
Yeah.
Which I hate to do to our friend Fillmore, because as I alluded to in the beginning of the podcast, one of the reasons why Evan and I cherish this president so much is because we've always used him as kind of a fill-in for the obscure president that absolutely nobody knows about. And it was one of those things where, there was a game one time where Evan and I were trying to essentially, you had to use a password to maintain privacy in your lobby. And Evan and I joked that, okay, well, we got to choose a password that nobody's going to use, because if you use 420, everybody's going to guess that. And so we ended up, ironically choosing the password as Fillmore, because we knew that no one knows about Fillmore. And so if we use that password, nobody's going to hack our lobby, and we're going to have privacy maintained in our lobby. That's why Evan and I cherish this president so much. So it pains me to say that the most consequential thing about a second Fillmore presidency has nothing to do with Fillmore.
Yeah.
He's still irrelevant. It's just the fact that we don't have a president like Buchanan who's actively fomenting secessionism, who's actively aiding and abetting slaveholding states, stoking the flames, and setting up a scene where someone like Abraham Lincoln rises to the fore and essentially provokes secession altogether. Of course, that's not blaming Lincoln for secession. It's more so blaming Buchanan for secession, because Buchanan set up this whole scenario where the South felt emboldened, and the South felt that they had, that they were in the right in this situation because they had a friend in the White House. I think that Fillmore, a second Fillmore presidency of term, would see a person who is more focused on maintaining the Union, as we've said, and is less concerned and is certainly less of a sympathizer to the South than James Buchanan was, but is more so focused on doing everything that he can to ensure that the South is not put in a position to succeed and is not put in a position to secede. Excuse me. And I think that is where the crux of this is going to be, and that might be why border states like Tennessee and Kentucky are less amenable to seceding, is because they have in the White House someone who is broadly pro-union and isn't going to take any, acrimonious actions against the South. I think that would be one area that I would agree. But on the same token, they don't have James Buchanan, and James Buchanan is very friendly to the South. And it's really the aggressive anti-slavery rhetoric of Lincoln that I think pushes Kentucky and Tennessee and the rest of the South away.
Yeah, indeed.
But sorry, one more thing. But I think that is important it's important to understand the impact that a second Fillmore term would have on the Republican Party and by extension on Lincoln, because I think that is where we're going to see a huge, potentially, generational change in the electoral politics going forward. But I don't want to put the cart before the horse, so I'll let you get your thoughts in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one thing to think about with James Buchanan is famously, he reportedly said, now I don't know if this is an actual quote, I don't know if this is an apocryphal saying or not, but it is, as things go in history, if you repeat it often enough, it may in fact be true. But he said, as he was leaving the White House, to Abraham Lincoln, "Sir, if you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland," which is Buchanan's residence in Pennsylvania, "you are a happy man indeed." Buchanan really, in the end, kind of saw the presidency as a burden and did almost nothing to try and keep the Union together, to maintain order. When the Southern states started seceding under his watch, he basically, again, did squat about it and was more than happy to pass this off to have it become Lincoln's problem. The thing about Fillmore, like I've emphasized quite a few times, is he is a unionist, and he very much wants to keep the Union together. And he's going to do what he can to, of course, try and whip up compromises, try to keep the South happy, try to keep the North at least not upset, I would say. And so that's what I think is really interesting to see about this fork is, let's talk about, we can fast forward a little bit to the outset of the Civil War. We have Buchanan basically giving a federal fort and weaponry, allowing those to fall into rebel hands. Given Fillmore's proclivities, given his staunch stance against secession and his wanting to keep the Union together, if there's even any rumblings along that level, he's not going to want to call in the federal troops, but if something like that were to occur, I think he would be a willing participant. He wouldn't really want to, but he would be like, you know what, we got to do what we can to maintain order, clamp down on those sorts of things. And so I think even just having a president in the Oval Office that is more active in that sense, one could make the argument that, you can make it go either way. You can make the argument that either a more activist president that is against secessionism might cause the Southern states to want to secede sooner, or you could make the counter argument that him being able to threaten federal troops and, threaten this sort of forceful action may at least forestall such a measure from being followed through until later on in the alternate timeline. I personally feel like, given Fillmore's mix of being a former president, being a compromise candidate, being a compromiser in chief when he was during his first term, I think the South is going to look at the situation and say, okay, well, we didn't get Fremont. We didn't get the Republicans who would have just done everything they can to get rid of the institution of slavery. We didn't get who we wanted in Buchanan, but Fillmore's someone we can work with. He might not be ideal, but we can work with him. So, me personally, I feel like this probably delays the start of open, active hostilities. It might be for a few months, might be for a couple months, might be a year. But I think the Civil War is almost, in a practical sense, inevitable. But I do think one consequence of a Fillmore presidency is a delay in the start of the Civil War. What do you think about that?
I would agree with you on that, but I think we are not necessarily addressing the key issue as to why the Southern states initially succeeded. You say that the Southern states are seceding under Buchanan's watch, but what you don't mention is that the reason why they're seceding under Buchanan's watch is because it has become clear that Lincoln has won the presidency.
Right.
So the question becomes, does a second Fillmore term, the ascension of the Know Nothing Party, by extension, in any way impede that initial spark from ever lighting? And I think that there's reason to suspect that it does, right? I think that there's a reason to suspect that if the Know Nothing Party is able to win the presidency and is able to come into being, that may have a sort of smothering effect on the Republican Party, and it may stymie their ascension. I think ultimately, as you know, an anti-slavery party is going to arise in some form. Whether it's called the Republican Party and whether it's headed by Lincoln is entirely up for speculation. But some form of anti-slavery party will rise in the Republican Party's stead, or it may just be the Republican Party rises sooner. A rose by any other name smells as sweet. It's going to happen. But it's important to note that right around this time frame, the Republican Party was a brand new fledgling coalition of former Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats and abolitionists. And in our timeline, they have a strong second place finish. And yeah, Buchanan wins, but they have a strong second place finish. In this scenario, I mean, there's no contention that Buchanan comes second. I mean, Fillmore doesn't even come first, right? He's chosen by the House of Representatives.
Exactly.
So now what this sets us up for is a nation where it's not the Republicans versus the Democrats, it's the know-nothings versus the Democrats. And maybe that leaves that fills a vacuum that the Republican, and it sort of pushes the Republican Party out into the periphery, where the radical secession, rather radical abolitionists maybe have some strongholds in the North and New England, but they're not a national party that can win an election. And as a result, we don't see a Lincolnian figure emerge in the 1860 election. And as a result, the Civil War is delayed. And the South, I think it's safe to say that if we don't have Lincoln winning in 1860, the South is not going to secede under James Buchanan. They're just not going to do it. They're going to, I mean, we can have that discussion about whether they would still secede under Fillmore. I think that's unlikely, because I think Fillmore is going to be, like we said, very unionist, and he's going to, do whatever is necessary with both carrots and sticks to appease or threaten the South. And he's not going to allow secessionist tendencies to foment like Buchanan would. And at the same time, it appears unlikely to me that a figure like Lincoln could emerge in the 1860 election. Maybe in the election thereafter, but probably not in 1860. And I think that this has profound, effects, right? Because the Republican Party doesn't coalesce it doesn't win the presidency in 1860. That could be a huge
and I think
pivoting point.
Yeah,
but
and
do you agree, disagree?
Yeah, well, this is where I think we can have a little bit of a debate or disagreement, because I like where you're going with that. I'm just not really convinced that the American Party actually becomes the major political force that, kind of really ends up quashing, a upstart Republican Party, because let's look at the circumstances of the alternate timeline, right? Republicans come in a clear second. Democrats come in clear first. The know-nothings only win with Fillmore because he's a known entity and because he's the compromise candidate. So almost 80% of the country, right, did, in terms of the popular vote, did not vote for Fillmore. He's only there because we all could not agree on either Buchanan or Fremont. So with that in mind, and also given that Fillmore himself, like I said, he was not a nativist. The 35th United States Congress was strongly majority Democratic, right? Now, this, of course, changes in the 1860 election, but in the 1856 election, it was pretty strongly Democratic. So we have a compromise candidate, Fillmore, dealing with a strongly majority, you can argue almost hostile. I'm not going to say necessarily like directly hostile, but probably not, super keen on the fact that they're not in the position of power in the presidency, but they control the levers of Congress. So Fillmore's going to have to be doing what he can to fend off, very Southern sympathetic Democrats that hold both chambers of Congress. The Republicans they, again, have a strong second. They have about maybe like 30% or so, 30 to 40% of the vote in Congress. The know-nothings are, again, while they might still be in Congress, they're decidedly a third party. They're not going to be able to pull the levers of power. And Fillmore himself, like I've said, is not a nativist at his core. So you have an interesting scenario where, much like a lot of the Whig presidents, they end up, it wasn't Zachary Taylor, it was John Tyler. John Tyler was famously the president without a party, right? Because he ran again for re-election. His own party disowned him. The Whigs just kind of have this tendency to, not really like and kind of boot out their presidents because of their own fractional ideological disagreements. So I think, honestly, Fillmore could kind of become that sort of president where he is nominated by the know-nothings because of his name recognition and his ability to be a compromiser. When he comes into office, he is consumed with domestic affairs. He's consumed with, trying to keep the Union together. And I'm sure we'll get into this later on in the episode, Kai, because I think there's more discussion of the domestic agenda, which I think is really interesting. But the know-nothings are very famously nativist. They want to pass things like a 21-year residency requirement for foreign-born people to become American citizens. Fillmore doesn't care about that, right? He does not care. And so I could easily see a scenario where by the end of Fillmore's presidency, the know-nothings disown him, the Democrats don't like him, and the Republicans hate him because he is not doing anything to actually try and abolish slavery. So I can see Fillmore, for all of his efforts, ending up like a John Tyler. And that, to me, would lead to the Republican Party being the better answer or the stronger answer to the Democrats still. That's personally my take. That's kind of how I could see it fomenting. But I'll give you some space to counter that with your own interpretation, or if I was just so amazing and persuasive, maybe I've helped you to see the light. but what do you think about some of my arguments there?
No, I think you make a very persuasive case as to why the know-nothings would fade into irrelevancy and kind of be this one-hit wonder and never really become a national party ever again. And I think that, again, we're talking hypotheticals here, so it's impossible to say.
This is what A Fork in Time is all about. We're here to discuss hypotheticals.
And I would say the key thing, if I had to come back with one response to what you said, it would be that we know Millard Fillmore as a Whig. We do not know how a Millard Fillmore as a know-nothing president would govern. And it's very conceivable that under the know-nothing ticket, his original, milquetoast approach to nativist policies, it becomes sidelined, and he acts more in line with his party because he sees he's trying to build this party into a bigger and more appealing party nationally. So whether that be that he really sinks his teeth into know-nothing politics and actually does what the know-nothing party wants him to do, or by contrast he tempers know-nothing ideology. He tempers it to make it more appealing to the parties that are now no longer represented, like the Democrat with the presidency, like Democratic voters and Republican voters, and starts to build sort of coalition that maybe looks more like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and ultimately replaces one of those. Because at this point, it is by no means, it's so easy to think about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party today as being these, behemoths that have, centuries of political history behind them. And today they do. But back then they did not. And especially the Republican Party did not have that sort of.
It certainly was far from a given.
Huge, that huge inevitability to it. It had huge ability to it now, but it didn't back then. And it's very conceivable that the Republican Party just kind of it's like I said, it's smothered, and it's not that the nativist party, the Know Nothings, have a block of their own that is sufficient to win over the country. It's instead that the Republican Party, which has now been defeated and is splintering, is in some ways absorbed by part of the electorate of their electorate is absorbed by the Know Nothing, and part of the Democratic electorate that's disenfranchised is absorbed by the Know Nothings, creating this coalition party. Again, it's not something that I'm saying is definitive, but I'm saying it's something to consider, because we never had a Know Nothing president, and we never had a Know Nothing Fillmore. We only knew him as a Whig. And if there's one thing that we know about, first terms versus second terms with, President Trump, the first term can look a lot different from the second term. Same thing with Grover
that
Cleveland.
even happened with Grover Cleveland too.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
There you go. Yeah, well, I think we'll just kind of leave that as something that could be, up to a certain amount of interpretation, because I do think, whatever the labels necessarily are, I do think by the end. I think one thing we could probably agree on is Fillmore himself is likely not going to run again in 1860. Or if he does, he is probably not going to win because of a lot of factors that we'll probably get into for the rest of this show. But I think given, again, the nature of his being a compromise candidate and doing what he can to try and hold this raucous, fractious nation together, I think him like Buchanan is just going to come to the end of his second term and be like, yeah, I really don't want to deal with this anymore. Like, I'm kind of out, whether that means he loses or he just opts against running. I don't see, and remember, keep in mind that the 2-term limit for presidents was not enshrined in the Constitution at this point. It was just a tradition that was maintained because of George Washington only serving for 2 terms. And, until FDR, there really was no attempt to run for more than 2 terms. But be that as it may, I think what's more interesting about a Fillmore president, even more interesting than the potential impacts on the future Civil War and the 1860 election, are some of the, more ancillary issues that happened from 1856 to 1860, which in our timeline were either on the side or they were pretty big deals. So I'll get into the first one, which I'll kind of go from like most relevant to slavery and the major issues of the Civil War down to least relevant. And I think the first main issue to talk about is Bleeding Kansas and the Lecompton Constitution. Now, for those of us who aren't familiar with that, to vastly oversimplify the issue, a lot of what happened with the Compromise of 1850 basically said, okay, slave states could be above a certain meridian, the free states above a certain meridian, slave states below a certain meridian. And for every new slave state that was entered into the Union, you also had to have a corresponding free state. And this seemed like a pretty good framework, plausible framework. And it worked decently well until you start having dueling state governments, both trying to claim control of a certain territory. Such was the case with Kansas. And in our timeline, Actually, I forget. Do you happen to remember off the top of your head when exactly Bleeding Kansas happened, Kai? I'm looking it up right now, but
I don't remember the exact year.
okay, yeah,
think
1854 and 1859.
yeah.
So
I was going to say it was before. Yeah.
yeah. So this happened during Franklin Pierce's presidency. But be that as it may, a lot of the events that happened would still, of course, bleed into a Millard Fillmore presidency, 2.0. And the Lecompton Constitution was drafted in 1857 by pro-slavery advocates in Kansas. And they were basically like, hey, we have this constitution that permits slavery. There was a dueling state government that had a different constitution that was recognized as the legitimate government of Kansas that said no. It was rejected by voters very strongly in Kansas. But be that as it may, Buchanan in our timeline, he famously supported the Lecompton Constitution. Even though it was a fraud, even though it got voted down by the voters, he just could not keep himself away from supporting pro-slavery documents and agitation, much to the chagrin even of a lot of his own close advisors. They were basically telling him, hey, look, dude, you should not support this. This will be really bad for you, for your image. He could care less. Kai, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say Fillmore's not going to be okay with this. Unless you happen to have some sort of revelation that said that Millard Fillmore endorsed the Lecompton Constitution. I think this strikes very much against both the spirit and the letter of, preserving national unity, what the compromises of 1850 were about. I mean, again, keep in mind, Fillmore was one of the main architects of the Compromise of 1850. So would you agree with me in saying that Fillmore is, unlike Buchanan, not going to support the Lecompton Constitution and put a much firmer kibosh on the events of Bleeding Kansas than Buchanan allowed to happen in our timeline?
To an extent, yes. I think that in principle, he's 100% going to be opposed. Remember, he's a strict legalist. He believes in the Constitution. He is going to probably be appalled by the idea of a Constitution being adopted that was explicitly rejected by the electorate. That's clear. Now, I think where we may differ and where there may be a disagreement is in the nature of his opposition to the Lecompton Conference, because again, we're going to have a situation where where Fillmore has to balance his two ideologies. And again, he's going to have to compromise, just as he's been accustomed to doing before. Because although he is in principle opposed to the Lecompton Constitution, he is going to be very, very, very careful not to provoke secession from the southern states. So he will take action, I'm sure, to avoid provocation, while also ensuring that some sort of compromise is reached that doesn't just completely overhaul the will of the voters. I think that's ultimately the position that Fillmore would take. So we can debate how that manifests. I think he would be incredibly reticent to send in federal troops, for example. But he may be very adamant about bringing all parties to the table to negotiate some sort of compromise, because, again, he's not going to stand for that sort of constitution sitting, as Buchanan was willing to do.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I see it kind of playing out very similarly to what happened in our timeline, because in our timeline, the election results were basically accepted. Again, even though Buchanan had endorsed the Lecompton Constitution, the election result was accepted. Kansas was admitted as a free state in 1861, I believe. I'm pretty sure it was like in the beginning, or it might have been during the lame duck period, between Buchanan and Lincoln. But regardless, I think maybe the only difference could be that Kansas might have been admitted as a free state maybe a little sooner. I don't know. But I don't know if necessarily anything would necessarily majorly change with regards to the outcome of Bleeding Kansas. I do think it's kind of an indication of the temperature in the room having a president in the Oval Office that is not actively supporting a fraudulent pro-slavery document, I think that would be very interesting to see happen. So yeah, I think I agree with your interpretation.
Yeah, I think it may have just fizzled out sooner under a second Fillmore presidency, and it would not have reached the level that it reached under a sympathetic Buchanan presidency.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The next main issue that I wanted to think about is the impact of the infamous Dred Scott decision. With the Supreme Court in our time and with the Buchanan presidency, this was kind of still during the time period, and we still see this even up to this day, but especially back then, presidents just really liked to try and meddle with the Supreme Court. And the Dred Scott decision, to not get too far into the weeds here, it basically focused on the case of an African man who he was a slave to someone who lived in the South. He then was transported across state lines to a free state. And I don't remember all the particular germane details, but I don't know if his master had moved to the free state or if he was just taken to the free state and then brought back to the South. I don't necessarily remember all of those details, but the legal case was that Dred Scott had argued for his freedom because he was transported to a free state. That is, I believe, the essence of what the case was about.
Yeah, essentially they went into a free state, I think it was Illinois, and he claimed that because he set foot in a free state that he was now no longer legally considered to be a slave because in Illinois slavery was not recognized.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court famously rejected his argument and said that, slaves are slaves no matter where they are transported. Now, Buchanan, in our timeline, had secretly, lobbied, essentially, the Supreme Court and basically really heavily pushed behind the scenes for them to make that decision. Do we think that is also going to happen in this alternate timeline with President Fillmore?
Oh, that's a good question. Because I think the Dred Scott decision would still be advocated for by Fillmore.
You think so?
And the reason, yes, because the reason why I think it would be because if Dred Scott if the decision had gone the other way, my impression is that the South would have correctly seen that as a provocation, and it would have, in Fillmore's mind, again, Fillmore, the staunch unionist, the person whose almost sole vision is to preserve the Union, that he would see that as a threat, he would perceive the South as perceiving that as a threat, and that therefore he would be against such a provocation, because to him it would be more important to appease the Southern states than it would be to oppose, or than it would be to lobby for his personal dislike of slavery. If that makes sense.
Well, and I think, I would tend to agree with that. I think the main thrust of my question was, would we see Fillmore actively promoting this decision and secretly lobbying the Supreme Court to do so? I don't see that happening at all. I see Fillmore as a respecter of the institution. I see Fillmore as someone who respects the court and as someone who would have gone ahead and allowed enforcement of the decision, but I don't see him as one who would necessarily be, pacing the floor back and forth at midnight, making phone calls, tweeting at the Supreme Court justices like, hey, you should make this decision, Yeah,
I don't see him doing that either.
Yeah, I think it really
mainly because Twitter didn't exist.
Right, exactly. Oh my goodness, Twitter and the internet did not exist back in the 1800s. Who would have thunk? But I think it's, again, another one of those instances where the event probably still happens and plays out similarly to our timeline. We just have a president who has a different, take on the matter, different tactics, I guess you can say. So the North is still going to be ticked off by this. abolitionists, the Republicans, they're going to be very upset by this. But Fillmore's a pragmatist. He might not have agreed with it, but he would have allowed the decision's enforcement. So that's where I see that going and that taking place.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think it ultimately is not going to change the actual nature of the decision. Because while
No.
Fillmore may not be actively advocating for it, I also do not see him actively advocating against it. And so he's going to leave it to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court is going to also have all of the same considerations that it did when it initially made the decision. So I think Dred Scott still happens in the same way that it does. It just may be the case that Fillmore is less supportive than Buchanan, but I think ultimately, if you put a gun to Fillmore's head and you said, how should the Supreme Court side in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case? He would say they should side against Dred Scott.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that.
Do you agree with that?
For sure. Yeah,
Yes.
I think Fillmore would, even if he didn't want that to be the case, I think he, just given the legal interpretations and everything at the time, and again, him being the consummate compromiser, he probably would not have been okay with the decision, no matter the moral implications of it. He would not have been okay with the decision that said, hey, all you need to do to become free as, an enslaved person is to,
cross the border
into a free state. Like, I think he would have recognized that would have pragmatically been extremely problematic. So yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that. The last main thing that I wanted to talk about, and there's some other issues that I know I have, secret access to Kai's document that he wrote, and he has secret access to mine. So we kind of loosely know where we're going here. But the last major issue that I wanted to talk about, which I see being handled quite differently from the Buchanan presidency, is the Utah question, the situation with the territory of Utah and what became known as the Utah War. In our timeline, James Buchanan kind of saw the Mormons and the Mormon Church as a breakaway group, troublemakers, problematic, and I'm vastly, again, for sake of time, vastly oversimplifying the situation here, but the Mormons went out west, they faced a lot of persecution, so they decided to try and form the independent state of Deseret. Well, not really, and that's not really happening yet, but they end up in what is now Utah, and they have some policies, they have some beliefs that from the United States government's perspective are rather problematic. Primarily their stance on polygamy and their permission of it. In our timeline, we almost get to the point of outright war with the Mormons, we meaning the United States federal government. They actually send out military assets out west to try and quell and put down a potential uprising. Buchanan, in other words, had no real sympathy for the Mormons, was kind of against what they were doing, and he felt, the one thing that he stood up for in terms of trying to preserve the Union in some form or fashion was, we can't let the Mormons have more than one wife. Like, you can have and enslave black people all you want, but if you try to have two wives, that's where I draw the line. Like, the guy had some very interesting moral paradigms, a moral framework that he liked to follow, I guess you can say. So in our timeline, that's kind of essentially what happens. And Utah does not actually become a state until 1896, primarily because the Mormon Church essentially had to be cajoled and forced into making significant concessions, especially, again, on the area of polygamy, to where we were finally okay with allowing them in as a state. But in the alternate timeline, I do see things going a little bit differently. Fillmore was the president when the Utah Territory kind of started being organized, and he was the one who appointed Brigham Young, I believe, as the territorial governor of Utah at the time. So I think he has some respect. He has some street cred with the Mormons. That's kind of a weird phrase to put in the same sentence with Mormons. But I think Fillmore has some, street cred. And for me, I personally feel like he's going to be able to reach some form of peaceful settlement, some sort of agreement, if not just kind of turning the other way and allowing them to do more of what they want, because in his mind, he has bigger fish to fry, especially with everything going on with the potential for secession. Makai, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree with that. I think that, yeah, pretty much everything that you said is how I think it would pan out with regards to the Utah issue, which kind of bleeds into one, like it's part of a larger scheme though. And I think how you've described Fillmore's behavior there would be mirrored in how he would behave in the larger context of Manifest Destiny, which is the, westward expansion of the United States. And I think that Fillmore, because, there's aggressive expansion in the 1850s, and I think
1840s,
that Fillmore,
1850s, yeah.
1840s, 1850s, yeah. I think that Fillmore is, as a know-nothing president, going to be heavily focused on domestic order, restricting immigration, and the aggressive expansionist policies are going to be sort of sequestered to the sideline. And I think because, the Democrats, they're desperate to expand as they always were. They want to annex Cuba, they want to take over Central America, they want to seize Mexico, they want to do all of those things, Cuba, etc. And I think that Fillmore is going to be opposed to all of those things. And he's going to take a much more sideline stance where he's not going to be aggressive about these things, which I think it has some interesting implications. Obviously, I think Cuba is going to remain Spanish. I think that we're not going to see a unified transcontinental railroad pushing between the West in the early 1860s. And I think we're going to see the West remain a vast and loosely governed territory for a lot longer. And I think we're going to see indigenous nations like the Comanche and the Lakota. They're going to maintain sovereignty over the Great Plains for a couple more decades because, again, there's a politically unstable Washington that doesn't have the resources or the unified population to launch those military campaigns. So I think that's going to be one consequence of a second Fillmore
and
term.
Something that I tend to agree with you on this as well is because we're not sending military assets to Utah to deal with the Mormons.
Exactly. That's why I said that it's in keeping with that.
Exactly. Yeah. No. And I was just saying, I was highlighting and voicing my agreement with you on there is that we are going to be content to allow the Wild West to stay a lot more wild. Even though, California has become a state, we have a bunch of territory like west of the Mississippi. I think I would tend to agree with you on the broad strokes there. Most of what happened with Manifest Destiny had already happened by, this point, with Millard Fillmore taking over. But you do make an astute observation that the more aggressively expansionist noises of the filibusters, for example, and filibuster, doesn't mean like standing on the Senate floor for 24 hours making a speech. It basically means private citizens or those with some military connections are going in and trying to stir up trouble, but which would eventually lead to those territories being annexed by the United States or become their own little personal fiefdoms, independent nations. Time to drop the obligatory reference to another friend of the pod, William Walker. He was one of these filibusterers. And so if you have a president who is actively clamping down or at least voicing very implicit, strong disapproval of these activities, that'd be pretty fascinating. Very interesting to see how the tail effects of those actions later on into the timeline.
Yeah, I don't think Manifest Destiny comes to a complete halt under Fillmore.
No.
I think that Manifest Destiny is in a lot of ways, a self-propelling force. But I think we see it slowed, and I think that in this timeline we can term it as not Manifest Destiny, but instead Minifest Destiny.
Haha, I like it. I like that pun. Anyway, I think one other thing I want to mention about Utah before we kind of start drawing this to a close, because just us two, we've been able to talk on this for well over an hour. So as we start kind of bringing the plane down for a landing, I do want to mention, I think what ultimately ends up happening with Utah is we see Fillmore kind of being a little more laissez-faire, live and let live, not sending the troops out west to quell things. I do think that having essentially the Mormon church continuing their own version of Far Cry 5 out in Utah is eventually going to cause bigger problems down the line. I think it will worsen conflict. And once the Civil War is dusted up, once that happens and, is put away, I think we could see a couple of interesting possibilities. We could either see the Utahns and people out more in this kind of greater Western Deseret region try and have a stronger push for their own state of Deseret, because we had that in our timeline. We even had, if I remember correctly, like some rumblings of an independence movement, which I think might get some stronger voices in this alternate timeline down the road. But essentially, whatever happens there, because I think it's a little bit too far, the ripples from that stone striking the pond are a little too far for us to trace during the course of this episode. I'm just going to leave it at, I think this kicking the can down the road with Utah is going to cause bigger problems later on the road and probably lead to a delay of their statehood. Could be by a few years, whatever it is. I just happen to think that it's going to make things a lot more uncomfortable for future presidents to deal with later on in the timeline.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that completely.
Yeah. But anyway, we've talked about a lot. We've been able to cover a lot of very interesting things that a Fillmore presidency might lead to. Are there any other major pronouncements or issues that you want to talk about before we deal with? I have on my notes, I call them side orders. We like to throw little side things out as possibilities towards the end of these episodes. But are there any major issues that you want to handle before we completely draw this to a close?
No, I think we covered the broad strokes of what would be the most important things in a second Fillmore presidency. And I think we kind of have an idea of what the consequences would be if we were to, in fact, give 4 more to Fillmore.
Yes, exactly. I'm hoping that Chris, he's in control of the post-production here, but I very much lobby for and advocate for this episode's title to be 4 more for Fillmore. But we'll see what he ultimately ends up deciding. I do have one, I think, well, 2, but really mainly one side order that I want to address. I already talked about the Millard Fillmore comic strip. We already talked about the password system we used in Elden Ring. That was the name of the game.
Yes.
In order to protect our room from raiding bands of marauders. But I do think that it is interesting, a little historical quirk, a little historical oddity about Grover Cleveland could have also been something that Fillmore could have actually upstaged him on as well. Grover Cleveland, not only was he the first president to have 2 non-consecutive terms, but he was also the first president to be married during the course of his presidency. He actually got married at the White House, if I recall correctly. But I think there's a pretty strong chance that Millard Fillmore actually could have upstaged him on that as well. Because in our timeline, Fillmore's wife passed away not too long after the end of his presidency, if I recall correctly. It might have even been during his presidency. But regardless, Fillmore was a bachelor by the time he ran in the 1856 election, I'm pretty sure. And he remarried in our timeline 5 years after he left the presidency. Well, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that in the alternate timeline, that would have meant that Fillmore would have been married right during the midst of his second presidential term. So I think there's a very strong possibility that he actually might have married again as president had he won the White House a second time, thus upstaging Cleveland in not only 1, but 2 separate ways. The last minor thing I wanted to throw out is while I was trawling across the internet, looking at different Reddit threads, because there have been some other people on the internet who have postulated about the possibility of a Fillmore presidency, there was one kind of more outlandish idea that I just kind of wanted to name drop. And that is of the idea of a corrupt bargain. There is one Reddit user that said that a Fillmore victory with Republican concessions would lead to the Democrats accusing him of a corrupt bargain. At minimum, this would have led to obstructionism and the impeachment of Millard Fillmore within the next 2 years, or even outright secession of the southern states. Now, given the course of where we went during this episode, I think our audience can very much see that Kai and I would disagree with this interpretation. But I don't know about you, Kai, but I do think it is kind of interesting to think about how more the mechanics of how Fillmore would have won the contingent election, because I myself going into this episode would have assumed that Fillmore would have allied himself with the Democrats because they are the ones who are in control of Congress. They have a stronger presence. Buchanan won the most votes, electoral college-wise and in the popular vote. So I always would have assumed that Fillmore would have tried to do some horse trading with the Democrats. But I mean, what do you think about this possibility of, obstructionism, impeachment, corrupt bargain, and Fillmore somehow working with the Republicans to try and get himself into power?
I think it's broadly unlikely. And I think it's broadly unlikely in the context of what we've described a second Fillmore presidency would have looked like. I think it's inconceivable that the Republicans would be on speaking terms with a Fillmore after his second term.
Yeah.
Of course, you
mean before his presidency? Because this is talking about
Correct.
him allying with the Republicans to get the presidency.
Right. No, yeah, I know, but I'm talking about before his presidency. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think that it would have been very unlikely that the Republicans would have wanted anything to do with Fillmore. I think it would have been similar to, or it would have been not unlike, Bill Clinton trying to run as a Republican in 2004. It would have been seen as something wildly, unthinkable, even if Bill Clinton's economic policies were not like radically different from the Republican Party's economic policies at the time. Just the fact that Bill Clinton is Bill Clinton would have been enough to dissuade the Republicans from cooperating with him in the same way I think they would have been opposed to working with Fillmore.
Yeah, exactly. No, I would tend to agree. I do think, even though this scenario posited by this Redditor is outlandish and likely would not have happened, I do think there is the interesting possibility of Fillmore having this sort of stench of possibly being seen as corrupt, or possibly, being seen as someone who got in via illicit means, even though it's, of course, it's literally in the Constitution. It's, something that can very much happen. House of Representatives votes by state delegation, not actually by individual representative votes. So yeah, there's a very strong possibility that even though Buchanan had more state delegations in his favor, Fillmore still had a strong showing of state delegations and could have been able to convince them to join his side. Again, I in no universe see Fillmore trying to take away from Republican support or get Republicans to support him. I think out of anybody in the political scene at that time, he would be trying to appeal to disaffected Democrats. But that's my personal take on the matter.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. But anyway, guys, I think that's about it for this show. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and listening. Let us know what you think. Would a Millard Fillmore presidency look substantially different from a Buchanan presidency? Do you agree with us? Disagree with us? Are there some topics or areas that you think we might have missed? Sound off and let us know in the Discord. We always love hearing your views. But with all that being said, I think I will throw the time-honored, age-old question over to Kai to come up on the fly with some sort of whimsical answer for. And that is, if we stumble across a fork in time, what do you think we should do with it?
Run as a know-nothing candidate and have our presidency decided by the House of Representatives.
You know what? I think that's the absolute right take to do. But, of course, the typical answer is we think you should take that fork. Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.